In the early month of 1942, the Dutch East Indies, the jewel of the Netherlands colonial empire in Asia, collapsed with a speed and violence that stunned even those who had long feared Japan's rise. For more than 3 centuries, the islands that would one day become Indonesia had been governed from distant The Hague, their cities shaped by European architecture, their society stratified by colonial hierarchies. Dutch officials, planners, and merchants believed their rule was secure under protective umbrella of British and American power. That illusion shattered almost overnight when Japanese forces, riding a tide of early victories across the Pacific, turned their attention southward. By January, Hong Kong and British Malaya had fallen. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in mid-February. The East Indies, rich in oil, rubber, and tin, resources Japan desperately needed to sustain its war machine, was the next target. The invasion began with precision and momentum. Japanese troops landed on the island of Tarakan in Borneo on January 11, 1942, quickly seizing its vital oil installations. Within weeks, they were advancing across Celebes, Ambon, and Bali, overwhelming scattered Dutch colonial units and ill-prepared local militias. The defenders were poorly coordinated, hampered by outdated equipment and lacking air support. Reinforcements from Britain, Australia, and the United States trickled in too slowly to make a difference. By late February, the combined Allied fleet was decisively defeated in the Battle of the Java Sea, leaving the archipelago exposed. The Dutch East Indies, defended by more than 100,000 colonial troops and police at the war's outset, crumbled under the weight of Japan's modern, battle-hardened army in less than 2 months. For the civilians scattered across the islands, Dutch settlers, Eurasian families, and indigenous people loyal to the colonial regime, the speed of the collapse was terrifying. Air raid sirens became a daily reality as Japanese bombers struck cities like Batavia, Surabaya, and Bandung, roads filled with refugees, women clutching suitcases, children crying as they stumbled through tropical heat, servants pushing carts pile-high with possessions. Rumors spread faster than official news. Some said the Japanese took no prisoners. Others claimed that women would be spared if they surrendered peacefully. Most had no idea what to expect, only that the world they had known was dissolving in real time. On Java and Sumatra, colonial officials issued hurried evacuation orders, but there was nowhere to run. Dutch families who had lived comfortably in spacious colonial homes found themselves herded into trains and trucks bound for improvised assembly points. The social order that had once shielded them, the invisible barrier of race and class that separated colonizer from colonized, collapsed with colonial government itself. In many towns, Indonesian nationalists welcomed the Japanese as liberators, further deepening the confusion for Europeans who had assumed local loyalty. In others, mobs looted abandoned homes as Dutch officials fled, adding lawlessness to the chaos. By the first week of March, Japanese troops were entering Batavia. Soldiers marched through the streets beneath the red sun of the imperial flag, their discipline and confidence a stark contrast to the disarray around them. For Dutch civilians watching from behind shuttered windows, the sight was both surreal and terrifying. They had been taught to believe in the superiority of European power, in the unassailable authority of the colonial order. Now that illusion was shattered as soldiers barked commands in a language they did not understand and ordered them out of their homes at gunpoint. Families were separated during chaotic roundups, with men sent one way and women and children another. Identity papers were confiscated, jewelry stripped away, possessions looted. In the space of a single afternoon, many went from privileged colonists to powerless captives. The speed of Japan's conquest left even the victor surprised. In less than 100 days, Tokyo had secured a vast swath of Southeast Asia, bringing more than 70 million people under its control. For the women and children of the Dutch East Indies, the suddenness of defeat created a psychological shock as profound as a physical danger. They had no framework for what was coming, no warning that captivity was not a brief inconvenience, but the beginning of a nightmare that would last years. Even in the first days of occupation, rumors of brutality spread to the holding pens and temporary camps. Women whispered about assaults in isolated villages, about soldiers who had dragged girls from convoys, about neighbors who had vanished without explanation. Most dismissed these stories as exaggerations born of fear. Within weeks, They would learn how little exaggeration there was, and how much darker their reality was about to become. The first time many Dutch civilians saw Japanese soldiers up close was not on a battlefield, but through the windows of their own homes. In the days following surrender in March 1942, the rising sun flag appeared everywhere, painted hastily on trucks, draped over government buildings, fluttering from telephone poles where Dutch flags had hung for decades. Soldiers marched down cobblestone streets that had once echoed with the footsteps of colonial officials in pressed linen suits. They were lean, young, and utterly confident, moving with a precision that left no doubt about who was now in control. At first, some Dutch civilians clung to the belief that they would be treated according to the conventions of war. Japan, after all, was a modern nation. Surely they would respect women and children, respect property, and maintain some semblance of order. That illusion did not survive the first week of occupation. In Batavia, soldiers burst into European neighborhoods, banging rifle butts against doors and shouting orders in Japanese. Families who would stay behind, too old, too sick, or too hopeful to flee, were dragged into the streets while their homes were searched. The official order spoke of confiscation for military use, but in practice the process resembled looting. Radios, watches, typewriters, silverware, and anything else of value vanished into trucks and canvas bags. Soldiers laughed as they tried on hats and coats taken from wardrobes. In some cases, they destroyed furniture simply because they could. The message was clear. The privileges Dutch colonists had enjoyed for generations no longer existed. Their wealth, their authority, even their right to dignity had evaporated the moment the rising sun appeared above their doorways. The behavior of the occupiers varied wildly from place to place, but cruelty was never far from the surface. In Surabaya, soldiers marched Dutch civilians to public squares and forced them to kneel in the sun for hours as a demonstration of subjugation. Anyone who protested was struck with a butt of a rifle or a bamboo cane. In Bandung, reports circulated of women assaulted during searches, dragged into separate rooms under the pretense of interrogation. Many families tried to shield their daughters by disguising them as servants or hiding them in cellars. But searches were thorough and often brutal. What began as isolated incidents quickly became patterns. Acts of violence tolerated, then encouraged, then institutionalized as part of occupation policy. The reversal of status was particularly shocking for those who had been at the top of the colonial hierarchy. Dutch planners and administrators who had once given orders to local police now found themselves bowing deeply to 19-year-old privates. Teachers and civil servants who had signed official documents with flowing signatures now scrawled their names on lists of detainees. Women accustomed to commanding servants were slapped if they failed to obey shouted instructions fast enough. The humiliation was deliberate. Japanese occupation authorities understood that breaking the psychological hold of European dominance was as important as military victory. Every insult, every confiscated possession, every forced bow was a calculated blow against a centuries-old structure of power. For mixed-race families and Eurasians who had lived between worlds, the collapse of colonial order was especially disorienting. Many had believed their European ancestry would offer protection. Instead, they discovered that to the occupiers, they were enemies first and anything else second. Even those who spoke Japanese or had business ties to Japanese companies were not spared suspicion. Interrogations were frequent and often violent. Some men disappeared after being accused of espionage or collaboration with the Allies. Women were left to fend for themselves in homes stripped bare of valuables, their days governed by curfews, ration cards, and fear. In cities and rural towns alike, the occupation quickly became synonymous with unpredictability. Some soldiers treated civilians with indifference, taking what they wanted and moving on. Others seemed driven by resentment, eager to humiliate those they had long viewed as colonial oppressors. A Dutch family in Samarang recalled soldiers bursting into their home and forcing them to watch as cherished heirlooms, a piano shipped from Europe, a grandfather clock, family portraits, were smashed to pieces on the floor. It was not theft but spectacle, a demonstration that the old order was dead and would never return. The violence did not stop at property. Dutchmen accused of resisting were beaten in public squares. Their punishment meant to deter others. In several towns, Civilians were lined up and forced to witness executions of local officials who had remained loyal to the colonial government. The occupiers understood the power of fear, and they wielded it ruthlessly. Even ordinary routines, a walk to the market, a visit to a neighbor, carried risks. Women reported being harassed or assaulted on the streets, while others vanished entirely, taken away in trucks with no explanation. Letters to the outside world were censored or never delivered, cutting families off from any hope of help. By the end of that first month, any illusions of humane treatment were gone. The Dutch who had once ruled this land were now subjects, their lives governed by the whims of occupying soldiers and the arbitrary cruelty of a system that recognized no law beyond imperial will. The rising sun in the window was not just a flag. It was a warning that the world as they had known it was gone, and that survival in this new reality would depend not on status, nationality, or law, but on endurance. The roundups began quietly at first, with typed notices posted on street corners and outside police stations ordering all Dutch nationals to register with the occupation authorities. Many dismissed these as bureaucratic measures, expecting to sign papers and return home. But within days, the notices were followed by soldiers at the door, demanding compliance not as a request, but as an order. Trucks rolled into European district at dawn, and the clatter of boots on cobblestones replaced the once familiar rhythms of morning life. Entire families were marched into the streets, carrying whatever they could gather in a few frantic minutes. A suitcase hastily packed with clothes, a family Bible, a child's toy clutched in small hands. The homes they left behind, often filled with generations of possessions and memories, were sealed off or looted before nightfall. In Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies, the process was systematic and relentless. Streets that had once been lined with shaded villas and flowered verandas became corridors of fear as soldiers moved from house to house. Some families had been warned by neighbors and fled into the interior, but most had nowhere to go. The railway stations were under guard, and any attempt to leave the city without a permit was treated as sabotage. Within a week, thousands of civilians had been rounded up and herded into assembly points. Schools, sports fields, municipal buildings, their names checked against lists compiled from colonial census records. There were no explanations offered, no assurances given. The soldiers spoke little Dutch, and interpreters were brusque and impatient. All that mattered was that the foreigners were removed from their homes and placed under Japanese control. In Bandung, the roundups were even more chaotic. Trucks overflowing with families rumbled through the streets, past cheering crowds of Indonesian onlookers who saw the collapse of colonial power as a long overdue reckoning. At collection points, men were separated from their wives and children without warning. Fathers were ordered into one line, women and children into another. Some families clung to each other, refusing to let go until rifle butts and blows from bamboo poles forced them apart. Mothers tried to shield their children from the shouting and confusion, but nothing could soften the terror of watching a husband or father disappear into a column marching toward an unknown destination. Some men were sent to work camps or military prisons, while others vanished into a vast network of forced labor projects scattered across Southeast Asia. Most families never learned their fate. The places that became detention centers were never meant to house large numbers of people. Schools still bearing blackboards and chalk dust were converted into barracks by sealing windows with bamboo and stretching barbed wire around playgrounds. Warehouses that had once stored coffee and rubber now held hundreds of civilians crammed onto bare floors. In Surabaya, a disused army barracks was filled beyond capacity, its latrines overflowing within days and its water supply failing under the strain. Privacy was non-existent. Families slept shoulder to shoulder, separated from strangers only by thin sheets or makeshift partitions of old doors and furniture. The smell of sweat, sewage, and fear hung thick in the air. Conditions during transport were often worse than the camps themselves. Women and children were packed into trucks or rail cars with little ventilation, enduring journeys that lasted hours under the tropical sun. Guards barked orders to remain silent, and anyone who spoke out of turn risked being struck. Some children collapsed from dehydration before they arrived. In one notorious incident outside Semarang, a convoy stalled for 2 days due to a washed-out road. The prisoners were left in their trucks without food or water, and several infants died before the convoy resumed its journey. For many Dutch civilians, the reality of captivity only truly set in when the gates of the camps closed behind them. The transition from citizen to prisoner was brutally swift. Within a matter of days, people who once enjoyed gardens, servants, and afternoon teas found themselves lining up for watery soup and sleeping on woven mats. Watches and jewelry were confiscated upon arrival, along with radios and books. Even the most ordinary aspects of daily life, writing a letter, bathing, speaking to a family member in another section, now required permission. The camps were surrounded by bamboo fences topped with barbed wire, and armed guards paced the perimeters, barking orders at anyone who came too close. What unsettled many most was the abruptness with which their lives had been reduced to numbers and schedules. Roll calls at dawn, inspections at random, punishments without explanation. The routines of captivity replaced the rhythms of ordinary life. Those who asked when they would be released received only blank stares or blows in response. The truth was that no one knew. Some believed they would be held for a few weeks, others until the war ended. But as the weeks turned into months and the months stretched into years, one thing became painfully clear. The homes they had left behind were no longer theirs, and the world beyond the fences might never be the same again. The transformation from civilian to captive did not happen in an instant. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, and with chilling precision. Once inside the internment camps, the Japanese authorities set about dismantling not just the physical freedom of the Dutch women and children, but their very sense of identity. What began with the loss of a home or a husband soon extended to the erasure of names, histories, and individuality, a calculated effort to break the psychological resilience of those who might otherwise have clung to the memory of who they were before the war. The first step was the confiscation of documents. At intake, guards and clerks collected passports, birth certificates, marriage records, and residency papers, piling them into boxes with the same bureaucratic indifference one might use for inventorying tools. To the Japanese administration, these papers were meaningless relics of a defeated colonial order, reminders of sovereignty that no longer existed. But to the women who surrendered them, they were the final proof of who they were, proof of citizenship, family lineage, and a life lived beyond the fences. When the last document was taken, many felt as if their past itself had been stripped away. Next came the names. Dutch and European names, once spoken with pride and passed down through generations, were suddenly forbidden. Guards barked orders in Japanese, and interpreters told the captives that they were no longer to refer to one another by their European names in official records. Instead, they were assigned numbers, simple, impersonal sequences stamped on small metal tags or scrawled onto scraps of paper they were ordered to keep on their person. A woman who had been Johanna van der Velde, a teacher from Batavia, became prisoner 342. Her daughter Anna, who had just turned 12, became child 342B. Even in daily roll calls, their names were never spoken again. This renaming was more than an administrative convenience. It was a weapon. Stripped of the names that connected them to families, histories, and communities, the prisoners were made to feel anonymous, interchangeable parts in a system designed to control. To the guards, they were no longer wives or mothers, artists or teachers, colonists or citizens. They were bodies to be counted, mouths to be fed or starved, hands to be made to work. The practice echoed deeper currents of Japanese wartime ideology, which held that individual identity was subordinate to the state. By erasing names, the occupiers aimed to erase resistance, to grind individuality into submission. Possessions, too, were methodically removed. At registration, each prisoner was permitted to keep only a small bundle of personal items. Jewelry, photographs, watches, and heirlooms, things that had once symbolized memory, status, or love, were confiscated without explanation. Many were never seen again, sold off, or hoarded by guards. Even mundane objects like mirrors and brushes were seized, leaving women with few ways to maintain personal dignity. Clothing was reduced to plain-issue garments, often ill-fitting and deliberately uniform. Gone were the dresses and hats that had once signaled class and individuality in colonial society. In their place came drab, shapeless attire that rendered everyone indistinguishable. The impact of this systematic stripping away was profound. In the space of weeks, Women who had once presided over households with servants and gardens were transformed into nameless figures queuing for rations, their lives dictated by whistles and shouted commands. Conversations in the camps shifted, too. With names forbidden and possessions gone, many stopped speaking about their past altogether. It was too painful to remember the people they had been when so much of that person no longer existed. Children born in the camps grew up answering to numbers rather than names, and some would later say they struggled to reconnect with their identities even after liberation. The erasure extended into language and culture. Dutch language books, if found, were confiscated and burned. Letters written in European languages were censored or destroyed. Camp authorities insisted that notices and commands be issued in Japanese, often without translation, forcing the captives to learn basic phrases just to follow orders. The very words they used to think and speak, the sound of their childhood and family life, were deliberately pushed aside. It was another layer of disorientation, another way to sever their connection to the world beyond the wire. For the Japanese authorities, this campaign of dehumanization was not incidental. It was essential. A population that saw itself as victims might resist. A population that no longer recognized itself was far easier to control. Over time, even the most determined women felt the weight of anonymity pressing down on them. They began to doubt their worth, their memories, their sense of belonging. It was a slow erosion, invisible day by day, but devastating in its cumulative effect. By the time many realized how much of themselves they had lost, it was too late to reclaim it. They had become, as one survivor later put it, ghosts of the women we once were, nameless, voiceless, and forgotten even by ourselves. The first days inside the internment camps shattered whatever fragile expectations remained among the Dutch women and children who had been rounded up from their homes. Many had clung to the belief that the camps might function as temporary holding centers, uncomfortable perhaps, but tolerable until the war ended or an exchange of prisoners was arranged. What they found instead was a carefully engineered system designed to strip them of health, dignity, and hope. Life in these compounds was not just imprisonment. It was a calculated degradation of the human spirit, carried out day after day under a sun that seemed to burn hotter behind the barbed wire. Overcrowding was the first and most immediate shock. Classrooms meant for 30 students now housed 80 people. Warehouses that had once stored coffee or textiles became living quarters for hundreds. Space was so limited that families were forced to sleep shoulder to shoulder on bamboo mats or directly on the floor, with barely enough room to turn over in the night. Privacy disappeared entirely. Toilets were communal and often broken, forcing prisoners to queue for hours or resort to crude alternatives. Bathing facilities were scarce, sometimes a single bucket of water shared by dozens, and disease spread quickly through the fetid air. Dysentery, malaria, and beriberi became constant companions, their symptoms exacerbated by weakened immune systems and the near-total absence of medical care. Malnutrition followed closely behind. From the moment of arrival, food rations were deliberately minimal, designed less to sustain than to subdue. Bowls of thin rice gruel, a few slices of pickled vegetables, perhaps a scrap of fish once a week. This was a diet that sustained thousands of women and children for months on end. Hunger became the background hum of daily life, shaping every conversation and decision. Mothers skipped their portions to feed their children, who often still went to bed crying from emptiness. Adults grew gaunt, their hair falling out, their skin stretched tight over bones. Children stopped growing. The smallest illness could turn fatal because the body had no reserves left to fight. The guards enforced discipline with precision that bordered on cruelty. Every movement inside the camp was regulated. When to wake, when to eat, when to sleep, when to line up for roll call. Prisoners were expected to bow deeply whenever a Japanese officer passed, and any hesitation, even a glance held too long, was met with immediate violence. Beatings were commonplace and often public, designed to serve as both punishment and warning. A woman who was slow to respond to an order might be slapped to the ground with the butt of a rifle. Another who spoke Dutch too loudly could be forced to kneel on gravel under the midday sun until she collapsed. Even children were not exempt. A boy caught playing too near the fence was struck repeatedly with a bamboo pole, as the others were forced to watch in silence. Discipline extended beyond physical obedience to emotional submission. Camp authorities punished even small acts of defiance, a whispered complaint, a hidden letter, a smuggled scrap of bread, with harsh reprisals. Collective punishment was common. If one prisoner was caught breaking a rule, an entire barracks might be denied food for a day or made to stand at attention for hours without water. The aim was clear: to dissolve solidarity, to make the prisoners fear one another as much as they feared their captors. Under such conditions, trust frayed quickly, rumors of informers spread, and many learned to keep their thoughts and grievances locked inside. Daily routines were designed to reinforce this sense of powerlessness. Roll calls came before dawn and were often repeated several times a day. Prisoners were lined up in rows under the watchful eyes of guards who counted and recounted them, sometimes for hours, until every number matched. Work assignments, sweeping, digging, cleaning latrines, filled the rest of the day, though the tasks were often pointless. Women scrubbed floors that would be filthy again within hours or carried heavy loads back and forth simply because a guard demanded it. Exhaustion became a permanent state of being, yet idleness was punished too. Those caught resting without permission were beaten or forced into even harsher labor. The psychological toll was as damaging as the physical. With each passing week, the outside world seemed to fade from memory. News was forbidden, letters rarely delivered, and radios confiscated long before they entered the camps. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the endless routines of hunger, fear, and exhaustion. For many women, the hardest part was watching their children suffer, not just from illness and starvation, but from the erosion of childhood itself. Games, laughter, and curiosity gave way to silence and blank stares. Children learned quickly that cry invited punishment, that questions went unanswered, and that obedience was the only safe response. By the time the first monsoon rain swept across the compounds, most prisoners had long stopped wondering when they might be released. Survival itself had become the only goal. Survival measured not in days or weeks, but in each breath drawn, each bowl of watery rice swallowed, each punishment endured without breaking. The camps were not just places of confinement. They were machines built to grind down body and spirit alike. And for those trapped inside, every sunrise was a reminder that the nightmare was far from over. Death entered the camps quietly at first, a shadow that crept in with the fever and the hunger. No one expected it to linger. In those early weeks, when the women still believed they might be released or exchanged, illness seemed temporary, a hardship to endure until normal life resumed. But as the months dragged on, it became clear that death was not an occasional visitor. It was a permanent resident, one that slept, ate, and existed beside them every day. The combination of malnutrition, untreated disease, and relentless exhaustion meant that bodies began to fail, and once they did, there was little anyone could do. The diaries that survived the war are stark in their simplicity. "We slept beside the dead last night," wrote one woman in a battered notebook hidden beneath a floorboard. No one came to collect her body. She died after sunset, and by morning the flies had found her. We could not move her. There was no strength left, so we covered her with a sheet and pretended she was sleeping. Such entries are not rare. They recur again and again in the testimonies of survivors. Each one a small, heartbreaking record of how normalized the presence of death had become. The diseases that ravaged the camps were often preventable, but conditions made them unstoppable. Dysentery swept through the overcrowded barracks within weeks of the first rainy season. Latrines overflowed, water sources became contaminated, and the guards showed no interest in improving sanitation. Buckets of foul-smelling waste were carried by hand to makeshift pits dug outside the fences, but by then, the bacteria had already spread. Women who once prided themselves on cleanliness found themselves nursing their children in filth, their hands trembling with fever. "It started with stomach cramps," recalled one survivor. "Then came the bleeding. She cried out for water, but there was none left. By the time the guard opened the gate for morning roll call, she was gone." Malaria followed closely behind. The tropical nights were alive with mosquitoes, and the camp provided no nets or repellents. Once infected, prisoners often received no treatment. Quinine was hoarded for Japanese troops, leaving civilians to sweat through hallucinations and delirium. Some recovered, but many did not. Their bodies grew weaker each day, and eventually they simply stopped waking up. Starvation compounded every illness. With diets that barely sustained life, the body had no strength to fight infection. Cuts and scratches festered into fatal wounds. Coughs turned into pneumonia. Children's bellies swelled grotesquely as their limbs thinned to matchsticks. There were too many dead for the camp system to handle. Burial details, often made up of fellow prisoners, struggled to keep up, and when torrential rains made the ground too soft to dig, corpses were left under huts, covered with mats or blankets, until conditions allowed for burial. We tried to say prayers, one woman wrote, but sometimes there were 5, 6 bodies by morning. We stopped asking names. We stopped crying. We just waited for the cart. The carts themselves were crude affairs, wooden platforms dragged by prisoners or, in some camps, old wheelbarrows commandeered for purpose. The bodies were piled one atop another, limbs twisted, hair matted with sweat, eyes half open. Children watched them pass in silence, too accustomed to death to react. The psychological toll was immense. The living developed rituals to cope, small gestures that helped them maintain a fragile grip on humanity. Some placed flowers near the bodies, plucked from weeds growing along the fence. Others whispered final words, even if they had never known the deceased. But over time, even these rituals faded. Exhaustion dulled everything: fear, grief, compassion. The first time I saw a dead child, one survivor recalled decades later, I could not stop crying. By the 10th, I barely looked. That is what the camp did to us. It made death ordinary. For mothers, the most unbearable task was watching their children die. Some dug shallow graves themselves, refusing to let strangers handle the small, emaciated bodies. Others clutched their lifeless children to the night, unable to let go. "She died in my arms," read one diary entry. "I held her until dawn, even though I knew I had to give her up." The guards shouted at me to bring her to the pile, but I pretended not to hear. Such moments, repeated across dozens of camps, left scars that never fully healed. As the months turned into years, the population of the camps dwindled. New arrivals sometimes mistook the empty bunks as signs of transfers or releases, only to learn that their former occupants lay buried beyond the wire. Death was not something that happened and then passed. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, a constant presence that slept beside them, walked among them, and whispered in their ears at night. Even after liberation, many survivors said it was the smell they remembered most, the acrid mix of sweat, sickness, and decay that clung to everything. In the end, survival was not just a matter of enduring hunger and disease. It was a matter of learning to live among the dead and to keep breathing, even when every breath reminded them of those who no longer could. The destruction of dignity in the internment camps was not sudden or spectacular. It was a slow, grinding process, carried out not only through hunger and violence, but through the daily indignities that stripped women of their humanity piece by piece. Forced labor was central to this process. The Japanese authorities, viewing prisoners as resources to be exploited rather than protected, assigned them to endless physical tasks designed not merely to extract labor, but to remind them of their subjugation. Women who had once overseen servants or worked as teachers, nurses, and administrators now found themselves digging drainage ditches under a blazing tropical sun, their hands blistered and backs bent. The work was not about productivity. Much of it was pointless, repetitive, or deliberately degrading. Trenches dug one day were filled in the next. Heavy sacks of rice were hauled from one storage hut to another, and then back again. It was labor for its own sake, a demonstration of power, an instrument of control. Supervision was harsh and often brutal. Guards patrolled the work sites with bamboo rods or rifle butts, striking anyone who moved too slowly, spoke without permission, or paused a rest. Beatings were administered publicly, and they served as warnings to others. A woman who stumbled while carrying a bucket of water could expect to be slapped to the ground. Another who failed to bow deeply enough might be forced to kneel in the mud for hours while the rest continued their work. Some guards found sport in humiliation, forcing women to chant slogans in Japanese while they labored or mocking them for their broken attempts at the language. Others ordered them to sing patriotic songs or recite apologies for their colonial past, knowing that the words burned in their mouths. The message was always the same: They were no longer individuals with rights or worth. They were captives, tools to be used, bodies to be broken. Even the nature of the tasks themselves often seemed designed to erode dignity. Women were ordered to clean latrines with their bare hands, to haul human waste to distant pits, or to scrub the floors of guardhouses, while soldiers laughed and spat near their feet. Some were assigned to tend gardens planted for the enjoyment of Japanese officers, weeding and watering vegetables they would never taste. Others carried stones to repair paths or cut grass around perimeter fences, work that served no real purpose but kept them visibly and constantly subordinate. There were no exceptions for age or status. Elderly women who could barely stand were forced to sweep courtyards. Pregnant women labored until they collapsed, and many miscarried in the fields or ditches without medical attention. Sanitation, or the lack of it, compounded the humiliation. Toilets were little more than open pits, often overflowing and swarming with insects. Queues stretched long into the night, and the stench clung to the air and their bodies. Bathing was rare and often restricted to a single bucket of cold water shared among dozens. Many went weeks without properly washing, their hair matted and skin raw from filth and sweat. Menstrual hygiene was an unspoken misery. There were no sanitary products, and women resorted to rags torn from their few remaining clothes, which they washed and reused until they disintegrated. Infection was common, and the shame of soiling clothing in public was constant. Privacy, once a taken for granted part of life, vanished entirely. There were no walls between sleeping spaces, no curtains around latrines. Every act, bathing, relieving oneself, changing clothes, became a public performance, observed by guards and fellow prisoners alike. The psychological damage of this relentless exposure was profound. Many women spoke later of a numbness that settled over them, a dissociation from their own bodies as a way to endure the humiliation. "I stopped thinking of myself as a woman," one survivor recalled decades later. "I was just a thing that worked, that obeyed, that tried not to be noticed." Others described the shame of being seen naked, filthy, or weeping, unable to hide even their most private moments. The erosion of dignity was deliberate, a calculated part of the machinery of control. By breaking their sense of self-respect, the occupiers hoped to break their will. Yet even in the face of such degradation, small acts of defiance persisted. Women shared scraps of cloth to fashion crude undergarments, stole moments of privacy by shielding one another during bathing, and whispered words of comfort as they worked side by side. These gestures, though small, were acts of resistance, a refusal to let the camp system erase their humanity entirely. But the damage was lasting. For many, the humiliation of those years would follow them long after liberation, shaping how they saw themselves and their bodies for the rest of their lives. In the camps, dignity was not just taken. It was systematically dismantled, leaving scars that could not be seen but would never fully fade. For the children caught in the machinery of Japanese internment, captivity was not simply an interruption of childhood. It was a theft of it. Many of them were too young to understand the politics of war or the reasons their lives had been uprooted. They only knew that one day they had families, homes, schools, and familiar routines, and the next they were living behind fences, surrounded by strangers in uniforms and treated as enemies. For Dutch children in the camps, the experience was bewildering, terrifying, and often fatal. They suffered not just from hunger and illness, but from the deliberate dismantling of their innocence, their sense of security, and their very understanding of the world. Separation from parents was often the first trauma they endured. During the initial roundups, fathers were usually taken away first, sent to labor camps or prisons, never to be seen again. Some children were torn from their mothers as well, separated by age or administrative decisions. Infants were placed in overcrowded nurseries, toddlers assigned to groups supervised by strangers. Older children were sometimes used for labor, carrying water or sweeping compounds. Siblings were split apart, often without explanation, and many did not know for years whether their family members were alive. "I was 6 when they took my father," one survivor recalled decades later. "They told me he was working for the emperor now. I never saw him again." The daily routines imposed on children were designed to break their connection to their former lives and replace it with loyalty to their captors. Every morning, They were forced to line up and bow toward a rising sun flag, while guards shouted slogans they did not understand. Some were made to chant bonsai or recite pledges to the emperor. Any child who hesitated or performed the ritual incorrectly risked a beating, sometimes with a bamboo stick, sometimes with the flat of a soldier's hand. These rituals were more than empty ceremony. They were part of a deliberate campaign of indoctrination, meant to instill obedience and erase pride in their Dutch identity. Lessons in Japanese language and customs were introduced in some camps, and guards mocked children who spoke Dutch, punishing them for using their native tongue. Malnutrition, already severe among adults, was even more devastating for children. Their smaller bodies succumbed quickly to the effects of chronic hunger. Meals were sparse and nutritionally empty: thin rice porridge, watery broth, perhaps a few grains of beans or vegetables. Many children's growth was stunted. Their ribs became visible, their limbs frail and bird-like. Kwashiorkor, a disease caused by protein deficiency, left bellies distended and skin discolored. Diarrhea, dysentery, and vitamin deficiencies were rampant. Mothers who tried to save scraps from their own rations for their children often found it was not enough. "I watched my little brother grow weaker every day," one woman wrote in a memoir. "His hair fell out, his legs swelled, and still the guards shouted at him to stand during roll call. He died before his 7th birthday. Neglect and abuse compounded the physical suffering. Children were often left unattended for long periods, particularly when mothers were forced into labor. They scavenged for food in refuse heaps, drank from contaminated water sources, and slept on bare floors. Guards saw them as nuisances or potential threats. Beatings were frequent, sometimes for reasons as trivial as crying too loudly or failing to bow properly. In some camps, older boys were pressed into service as messengers or errand runners, exposing them to violence and humiliation. Girls, especially as they grew older, faced a constant threat of harassment. Many were subjected to unwanted touching or lewd comments, and a few were assaulted outright. Traumas they carried silently into adulthood. The psychological scars ran deep. For many of these children, the camp became the only world they knew. They forgot the taste of fresh fruit, the sound of music, the feeling of safety. Play, when it happened at all, was subdued, a scrap of cloth fashioned into a doll, a stick dragged through the dirt to make shapes. Laughter was rare, and when it did break out, it was quickly silenced by the bark of a guard's order. The longer the war went on, the harder it became for them to remember life before the wire. "We stopped dreaming," one survivor said. "We didn't imagine birthdays or Christmas anymore. We only imagined the next meal." When liberation finally came, many of these children did not celebrate. They were too weak to stand, too traumatized to process the meaning of freedom. Some were reunited with parents they no longer recognized. Others discovered their families were gone, leaving them alone in a world that felt as alien as the camp itself. The survivors carried the legacy of captivity into adulthood, nightmares that would not fade, distrust of authority, an enduring fear of hunger. For decades, many remained silent, unable or unwilling to revisit those years. Childhood had ended not with adolescence, but with the sound of boots on gravel, the crack of a guard stick, and the daily humiliation of being forced to bow to a flag that was not their own. Among the most painful and deliberately hidden aspects of the Japanese occupation of the Dutch East Indies was a system euphemistically called comfort stations. It was a term designed to sound benign, even protective, but behind it lay one of the most systematic and brutal violations of human dignity during the war. For many Dutch women, captivity was already a daily ordeal of hunger, humiliation, and fear. But for a smaller, targeted group, the nightmare took on an even more horrifying dimension when they were forcibly taken from the camps and made to serve as sexual slaves for the Imperial Japanese military. The establishment of these comfort stations was not spontaneous or chaotic. It was organized and deliberate, a policy implemented across the occupied territories to supply Japanese soldiers with access to women under controlled conditions. The military claimed it was necessary to maintain troop morale, prevent random assaults, and reduce the spread of disease. In reality, it was a calculated exploitation of power and desperation. Buildings, sometimes commandeered houses, sometimes purpose-built barracks, were converted into brothels. They were guarded, isolated, and kept under strict military control. Few civilians ever saw the inside of them, and those who did rarely spoke of it again. Selection often began in the camps with little warning. Women were summoned by name or number to report to the commandant's office or a designated gathering point. At first, many believed they were being reassigned to labor or transferred to another facility. Instead, they were taken away by truck, often under guard, and disappeared from camp life entirely. Rumors spread quickly among those left behind. Whispers that the missing had been sent to comfort houses for soldiers. Some refused to believe it, clinging to the idea that such things could not happen to European women. But those who returned, if they returned at all, bore silent witness to the truth in their hollow eyes and broken bodies. Victims came from all backgrounds: wives of colonial officials, teenage girls, nurses, teachers, even mothers separated from their children. There was no consistent pattern to who was chosen, though youth and appearance often sealed a woman's fate. Resistance was dangerous and usually futile. Some women who refused aboard the trucks were beaten unconscious or dragged away. Others attempted suicide before they could be taken. A few were hidden by fellow prisoners, concealed under floorboards or disguised as the elderly, but such efforts were rare and risky. The occupying authorities made clear that any attempt to interfere with their system would be punished severely, not just for the individual, but for the entire camp. Life inside the comfort stations was one of relentless degradation. Women were forced to submit to multiple soldiers a day, often with little rest, inadequate hygiene, and no medical care. Many suffered injuries, infections, and permanent damage to their health. Pregnancies were frequent, and abortions, sometimes performed without anesthesia, were common. Psychological trauma was as devastating as the physical abuse. Survivors later described dissociating from their bodies, retreating into a numb detachment to survive the repeated assaults. "I learned to float above myself," one woman testified years later. "The body below me was no longer mine. It was just something they used." The secrecy surrounding the comfort system was enforced with equal brutality. Victims were warned never to speak of what had happened, and those who did risked execution. After the war, many remained silent for decades, silenced by shame, fear of stigma, and the belief that no one would believe them. Even within the camps, the subject was cloaked in denial. Women who returned were often treated with suspicion or ostracized, their suffering compounded by isolation from their own community. Some never returned at all, executed when they were no longer deemed useful or killed during chaotic troop withdrawals in the final months of the war. It was only decades later, when survivors began to break their silence, that the true scope of the system became widely understood. Dutch women testified before war crimes tribunals and commissions, recounting stories that had been buried under layers of official denial. One of the most prominent was Jan Ruff O'Hearn, who spoke publicly in the 1990s about her ordeal after being seized from a camp in Java at the age of 21. Her testimony, and that of others, forced the world to confront a truth long ignored: that sexual slavery was not an aberration of the occupation, but a policy, one woven into machinery of imperial war. The legacy of the comfort stations remains deeply painful. For survivors, the trauma never truly ended. Many carried guilt and shame that was not theirs to bear. Others struggled with lifelong health problems, infertility, or fractured family relationships. But perhaps the most haunting aspect was the silence, the decades during which their suffering was erased from public memory, treated as an uncomfortable footnote rather than a central atrocity of the war. In telling their stories, they reclaimed not only their voices but their humanity, exposing a system that thrived on secrecy and silence. It was a darkness many never escaped, but their testimonies stand as unflinching evidence of what happens when power is unchecked and dignity is treated as expendable. Violence in the internment camps was not a reaction to resistance. It was a governing principle. The Japanese occupation authorities understood that fear was more effective than any wall or fence, and so they built their system of control on a foundation of cruelty. Punishment was not merely a consequence for disobedience. It was a daily ritual, a performance of power meant to crush the will of those trapped inside. Women quickly learned that the difference between a beating and a day without incident was often nothing more than the whim of a guard. Even perfect obedience offered no protection. The rules were vague, changeable and often contradictory, and that unpredictability was part of the punishment itself. Speaking Dutch, for example, was forbidden in many camps, but the ban was inconsistently enforced. A conversation whispered between mothers could go unnoticed one day and result in a savage beating the next. Guards carried bamboo rods, light enough to swing repeatedly, heavy enough to bruise and break bones, and they used them liberally. A misplaced word, a delayed bow, a moment of eye contact held too long could provoke a blow to the face or a series of strikes across the back. We never knew what would set them off, one survivor wrote years later. Sometimes it was nothing at all. Sometimes they just wanted to remind us who was in charge. Public punishment was common and deliberate. Women accused of minor infractions were dragged into open courtyards and forced to kneel for hours in the blazing sun. The heat was punishing, the ground often covered in gravel that tore at their skin. Guards paced back and forth, shouting insults, spitting on the prisoners, or striking them when they slumped from exhaustion. Those who fainted were doused with buckets of water and made to continue. Children were sometimes assembled to watch, a cruel lesson in the consequences of defiance. In one account, a woman caught hiding a scrap of bread was tied to a post in the center of the camp and beaten until she collapsed. She was then forced about repeatedly to her captors while they laughed and photographed the scene. Some punishments crossed the line into outright torture. Water torture, known among prisoners as the bucket punishment, was a favored method. Women were restrained and had water poured into their noses and mouths until they choked and gasped for air. The process would stop just before they lost consciousness, only to begin again. Others were made to stand in water pits for hours, sometimes days, exposed to mosquitoes and filth, their feet swelling and skin blistering. Interrogations were another source of brutality. Prisoners suspected of hiding information, often without evidence, were beaten, kicked, or subjected to mock executions. Threats of sexual violence were used to extract confessions, even when there was nothing to confess. Executions, though less frequent, were a terrifying reality. They were always public, staged as spectacles to enforce obedience through terror. Prisoners were assembled in silence while a woman accused of sabotage, escape attempts, or defiance was marched before them. The charges were often vague or entirely fabricated. Sometimes the condemned were forced to dig their own graves before being shot. In other cases, they were executed by bayonet, the guards shouting patriotic slogans as the act was carried out. "They made us watch every second," recalled one survivor. "We were not allowed to look away. They wanted us to remember." The message was unmistakable. Life and death inside the wire were entirely at the mercy of the occupiers. What made the system of punishment particularly devastating was its arbitrariness. There were no consistent rules, no appeals, no limits. A woman might be beaten for failing to bow deeply enough one day and ignored for a more serious violation the next. A child might be slapped for crying too loudly, while another was left alone. This randomness eroded any sense of justice or order, replacing it with a constant state of anxiety. Prisoners lived in fear not just of what they did, but of what they might do without realizing it. The camp became a landscape of uncertainty, where every word, movement, and glance carried potential for violence. The brutality also served a deeper purpose beyond immediate control. It was intended to break the spirit, to convince the prisoners that resistance, even in thought, was futile. The constant humiliation, the spectacle of punishment, the degradation of forced confessions all worked together to dismantle the idea that they still possessed any agency. By the end of the war, many prisoners described themselves as hollow, their capacity for outrage dulled by the relentless repetition of cruelty. Yet even in that hollowed state, the memories of the punishments endured, the sting of bamboo on skin, the ache of kneeling on gravel, the sound of gunshots echoing across the camp, remained vivid. For many survivors, it was not starvation or disease that defined their years of captivity, but the ever-present knowledge that punishment could strike at any moment, without reason and without mercy. Even in the darkest corners of the internment camps, where starvation, violence, and humiliation were designed to crush the human spirit, defiance refused to die. It did not appear as open rebellion. That would have been suicide. Instead, it took the form of quiet, invisible acts of resistance that often went unnoticed by the guards, but meant everything to those who endured them. For the Dutch women imprisoned in the Dutch East Indies, survival was not just a matter of enduring the cruelty inflicted upon them. It was also about holding on to their humanity, protecting one another, and preserving the truth of what was happening inside those walls. The sharing of food was one of the most common and dangerous acts of solidarity. Rations were already meager, barely enough to keep a person alive, yet women found ways to save scraps from their own bowls to give to the weakest among them. Mother pretended they were full so their children could eat more. Neighbors tucked small portions of rice into cloth bundles and slipped them under sleeping mats to be discovered later by those too sick or frail to stand in line at mealtime. Some bribed guards with jewelry or family heirlooms for extra rations, risking severe punishment if discovered. Others scavenged for edible weeds or insects, teaching each other which plants outside the fence could be boiled into a thin soup without drawing attention. These small acts did not end the hunger, but they often meant the difference between life and death for those on the brink. Equally courageous was the effort to hide the sick. Disease swept through the camps unchecked, and those who were visibly ill were often denied food or left to die without care. Guards saw them as useless mouths, burdens on the system. In response, women created hidden infirmaries in corners of barracks or beneath makeshift partitions, where they nursed the sick in secret. Quinine, if it could be stolen from a guard supply room or traded for valuables, was smuggled in and rationed drop by drop. Herbal remedies, remembered from home or learned from Indonesian locals, were brewed in hidden pots. Women risked severe beatings to conceal a feverish friend during roll call or to forge a list that showed the dead is still alive, buying precious time for one more dose of medicine, one more day of hope. Education, too, became a quiet form of resistance. The Japanese authorities had no interest in nurturing the minds of the children in the camps. Obedience was the only lesson they intended them to learn. But mothers, teachers, and older prisoners refused to let a generation grow up in ignorance. They organized secret lessons after dark, scratching arithmetic problems into the dirt or whispering stories of Dutch history and literature. Lessons in reading and writing continued with scraps of paper scavenged from discarded packaging and bits of charcoal stolen from the kitchens. Teaching was an act of defiance as profound as any uprising, a declaration that culture, memory, and identity could not be erased by barbed wire or bamboo sticks. Some women went further still, documenting their ordeal in coded diaries. Writing was forbidden and discovery could mean execution, but the urge to bear witness was too strong to suppress. Diaries were hidden in false walls, buried in jars beneath latrine pits, or stitched into the linings of clothing. They recorded daily rations, lists of the dead, details of beatings and abuses, and names of guards. Many of these accounts survived the war and later served as vital evidence in war crimes tribunals, exposing atrocities that might otherwise have been forgotten. "If they burn my body," one woman wrote in tiny, cramped letters, "at least these pages will speak." Solidarity extended beyond survival tactics. Women created networks of emotional support that were just as crucial as food or medicine. They comforted each other after beatings, shared memories of life before the war, and told stories to the children to help them sleep. They sewed small toys from scraps of fabric, sang lullabies under their breath, and held makeshift ceremonies to mark birthdays and holidays. These gestures, insignificant on the surface, were profound acts of resistance against a system determined to strip them of their humanity. Even humor, whispered jokes about the guards, mocking songs sung under one's breath, became a form of rebellion. In a world where laughter was forbidden, a shared smile was itself an act of defiance. Perhaps the most powerful resistance of all was the refusal to forget. The women understood that what they endured was not just cruelty but history, and that history needed witnesses. Their diaries, testimonies, and memories became weapons against silence. After the war, those records exposed the reality of life in the camps and ensured that the suffering of the prisoners could not be erased from memory. But even before liberation, they served another purpose. They reminded the women that they were still individuals, still part of community, still capable of choice. In a world built to erase them, the decision to care for one another, to teach, to remember, and to bear witness was a quiet revolution. It was proof that even under the most total domination, the human spirit could find ways to resist. Isolation was one of the most insidious weapons used against the Dutch women and children imprisoned in the camps. It was not as visible as beatings or starvation, but it was just as effective at breaking spirits. From the moment they passed through the gates, the outside world vanished. Letters stopped arriving, radios were confiscated, and any form of communication beyond the fences was cut off. The walls of the camp were not just physical barriers of bamboo and barbed wire. They were barriers of silence. Over weeks and months, that silence deepened until many prisoners began to feel as if the rest of the world no longer knew they existed at all. Before the war, many of these women had believed that international law offered some measure of protection. The 1929 Geneva Convention, to which Japan was a signatory, guaranteed humane treatment for prisoners of war and allowed for inspection by neutral observers such as the International Committee of the Red Cross. Families separated by conflict could exchange letters, parcels of food and clothing could be delivered, and conditions could be monitored to prevent abuses. In the camps of the Dutch East Indies, none of this happened. Japan not only ignored those obligations, but actively blocked any attempts by outside organizations to intervene. No inspectors ever appeared at the gates. No relief shipments arrived. No messages from husbands or parents or children on the outside were delivered. The silence was deliberate and total. At first, the prisoners tried to convince themselves that the Red Cross would come eventually. Rumors circulated with every passing month. Someone claimed that a truck had been seen beyond the wire. Another insisted they had overheard guards mention foreign visitors. These stories always turned out to be false. As the months turned into years, hope withered. We waited for a letter that never came. One woman wrote in her diary, "We told ourselves that our families must be trying to reach us. But the truth we dared not speak was that we had been forgotten." Mothers whispered lies to their children to keep them calm, that their fathers were safe and would write soon, that packages were on their way, that the war would be over by Christmas. As the seasons changed and those promises went unfulfilled, even children stopped asking. The lack of news from the outside world was more than an emotional hardship. It distorted reality. With no newspapers, no radio broadcasts, and no visitors, the prisoners had no way of knowing how the war was progressing. Rumors filled the void, some hopeful, others terrifying. One day, they heard that Germany had conquered all of Europe and Japan had won. The next, someone whispered that the Allies had landed in Asia and would arrive any day. The guards offered no information beyond vague boasts of Japanese victories, which many prisoners suspected were lies. This uncertainty created a constant state of anxiety. They did not know whether their loved ones were alive or dead, whether their home still stood, or even if their nation still existed. The psychological toll of this isolation was immense. It bred despair and a sense of invisibility. Without contact from the outside world, many prisoners began to feel as though they were fading from existence. "We began to doubt that we were real," one survivor recalled. "If no one knows you're alive, are you truly living?" Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays passed unmarked, their significance lost in the endless sameness of captivity. Even the concept of time itself became blurry. Some women scratched calendars into the walls or carved notches into wooden beams to track the passing days. Others stopped counting altogether, unable to bear the weight of how long they had been forgotten. The silence also served the occupiers' purposes. It deepened the prisoners' dependency and undermined their will to resist. Without external support, they had no reason to believe rescue was possible. Without letters or parcels, they were reminded daily that they were alone. The Japanese authorities understood the power of this isolation and enforced it ruthlessly. Attempts to smuggle out messages were punished severely. One woman caught trying to pass a note to a local worker was beaten unconscious and left without food for days. Another, who scribbled a letter on a scrap of cloth and hid it in her laundry, was dragged before the entire camp and humiliated publicly before being sent to solitary confinement. By the time the war entered its final years, most prisoners had accepted the silence as part of their reality. They no longer looked for mail trucks or scanned the horizon for visitors. They stopped talking about the Red Cross altogether. Hope had been replaced by a numb resignation, a belief that no one was coming. Not inspectors, not aid workers, not even the soldiers they once dreamed would liberate them. That sense of abandonment was perhaps the cruelest blow of all. It hollowed out their sense of self-worth and left scars that lasted long after the fences came down. Even decades later, many survivors spoke of that silence as the most haunting memory of their captivity. Hunger could be endured, beating survived, disease overcome, but to feel erased in the world, to believe that you've been forgotten by humanity itself, was a wound that never fully healed. The end of captivity did not come with a triumphant announcement or a sudden flinging open of the gates. It crept in quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the final weeks of the war, as the Japanese empire began to collapse under the weight of Allied advances. By mid-1945, rumors had started to drift into the camps. Whispers of American bombers devastating Japanese cities, of Germany surrendering Europe, of a new weapon so powerful it could destroy an entire city in a single blast. The guards, once so arrogant and cruel, began to change. They barked fewer orders, their patrols grew irregular, and their discipline frayed. Some disappeared entirely, abandoning their posts without explanation. Others grew more violent, lashing out unpredictably as defeat loomed. For the prisoners, this instability was terrifying. They had survived years of hunger, disease, and humiliation, but no one knew what their captors might do in their final desperate days. The announcement of Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, did not immediately reach most camps. Radios were forbidden, newspapers non-existent, and guards kept the news to themselves as long as possible. Days, even weeks, passed before Allied reconnaissance planes appeared overhead or troops arrived at the gates. In some camps, the Japanese quietly surrendered and handed over control. In others, they vanished during the night, leaving bewildered prisoners to wake up to silence and empty watchtowers. A few camps descended into chaos as desperate guards took revenge on the captives before fleeing, beating or even killing those who could not move quickly enough. For the women and children inside, liberation did not feel like a single moment of freedom. It was confusing, disorienting, and in some cases, almost anticlimactic. The suffering had lasted so long that many found it difficult to believe it was truly over. When Allied soldiers finally entered the camps, what they found was shocking even to hardened veterans. Many of the prisoners were skeletal, their limbs little more than sticks, their faces hollowed by starvation and disease. Hair hung in clumps, clothes hung in tatters, and some were too weak to stand. Medical teams rushed to provide aid, but even the simplest treatments, clean water, food, basic medicine, had to be administered carefully. For those whose bodies had been starved for years, too much food too quickly could be fatal. Nurses and doctors described scenes of women weeping uncontrollably as they were handed their first proper meals in years. Children staring in mute disbelief at tins of condensed milk and bars of chocolate. Liberation, while joyful, was also physically overwhelming. Many did not survive long enough to enjoy it, their bodies simply too damaged to recover. The psychological weight of freedom was heavy, too. Many women emerged from the camps unsure how to function in the world beyond the wire. They were haunted by memories of those who had died beside them and burdened by guilt for having survived when others had not. Children, some of whom had spent most or all their lives in captivity, were frightened by the unfamiliar sights and sounds of the outside world. They clung to routines of camp life, lining up for food, bowing automatically when approached, long after they were no longer required. Even reunions with surviving family members were not always joyful. Years of separation had changed people, and many discovered they no longer recognized the loved ones they had once known. Reintegration into colonial society was another painful ordeal. The Dutch East Indies they returned to was not the one they had left. The war had shattered the colonial order, and Indonesian nationalists were now fighting for independence. Streets once lined with Dutch flags now echoed with cries for revolution. Former prisoners, still weak and traumatized, found themselves caught in a new conflict they barely understood. Many returned to homes that no longer existed, looted or destroyed during the occupation. Others discovered that local servants and workers they had once employed now viewed them with resentment or outright hostility. The world beyond the fences was not simply free. It was transformed, unstable, and unfamiliar. For most survivors, the experience of the camps was something they rarely spoke of. The trauma was too deep, the memories too painful, and in many cases, There was little understanding or sympathy waiting for them. Society preferred stories of victory and resilience, not the humiliating reality of captivity. Women who had endured sexual violence remained silent for decades, fearing judgment or disbelief. Others were told to move on, as if years of suffering could be shed like an old coat. Many chose never to speak of it all, burying the memories in silence and carrying them alone for the rest of their lives. Yet even in that silence, the camps remained with them, in the way they hoarded food long after the war ended, in their instinct to ration water, in the nightmares that returned with every illness or loud noise. Liberation had freed their bodies, but for many, their minds remained behind the barbed wire. The world beyond the fence offered sunlight and open skies, but also brought a realization that the lives they had known before the war were gone forever. What lay ahead was not a return to the past, but the long, painful work of learning how to live again. For decades after the war ended, silence hung heavy over the lives of the women who had endured the internment camps of the Dutch East Indies. It was a silence born not only of trauma, but of shame, fear, and a conviction that no one wanted to hear what they had to say. In the years immediately following liberation, the world was eager to rebuild, to celebrate victory, to turn its attention to reconstruction and a future free from the horrors of global conflict. The narratives that emerged from that period often centered on battles won, treaties signed, and the triumph of democracy. There was little space in those stories for the suffering of civilians behind barbed wire, and even less for the deeply uncomfortable subject of sexual slavery. Many survivors internalized the idea that their pain was something to be hidden, a private burden rather than a public truth. The shame was particularly heavy for women who had been forced into the comfort stations. In societies where sexual violence carried stigma, many feared that speaking out would lead to rejection by their families or communities. Some never told their husbands or children what had happened to them. Others buried the memories so deeply that they tried to convince themselves they had forgotten. Diaries were hidden in drawers and never opened again. Letters describing the camps were destroyed. Testimonies that could have shaped public understanding of the war were left unwritten. Silence, for many, became a form of survival, a way to keep living in a world that seemed unwilling to confront the truth. But silence, like any prison, eventually cracks. By the 1980s, a new generation of historians, activists, and survivors began to question the omissions in the official narratives of the Second World War. Feminist scholars, in particular, pushed for a more complete understanding of conflict, one that included the experiences of women. War crimes investigations that had once focused exclusively on battlefield atrocities began to revisit the issue of civilian suffering. Slowly, painfully, survivors who had kept their stories locked away for decades began to speak. Among the most powerful voices was that of Jan Ruff-O'Hearn, a Dutch woman who had been taken from a camp in Java in 1944 and forced into a Japanese military brothel. For more than 50 years, she told no one but her closest family. Then, in the early 1990s, she stood before the world and told her story. Ruff-O'Hearn's testimony was a turning point. In public hearings, she described how she and other young women were selected, transported, and violated, how their bodies were treated as commodities to be used and discarded. She spoke of the physical pain, the psychological trauma, and the lifelong scars left by those experiences. Most of all, she spoke of the silence that followed, how shame and disbelief had kept her quiet, and how that silence had compounded the original crime. "I speak now," she told an audience at a war crimes tribunal, "because I want justice. I speak because I want the world to know that we were not prostitutes. We were young girls, many of us teenagers, and we were forced." Her courage inspired others to step forward. Survivors from Korea, China, the Philippines, and Indonesia shared similar stories, revealing a system of sexual slavery far more widespread and organized than many had believed. Their testimonies forced governments, scholars, and the public to confront uncomfortable truths. Japan had long downplayed or denied the existence of the comfort system, insisting that the women were voluntary prostitutes or that the military had played no direct role. The growing body of survivor accounts made those denials untenable. International pressure mounted for Japan to issue formal apologies and provide reparations. Though official responses were often hedged and incomplete, the testimony succeeded in shifting the historical conversation. They expose the deliberate nature of the comfort system, the scale of its operation, and the extent of the suffering it caused. They also challenge deeply ingrained attitudes about women, war, and victimhood, showing that sexual violence was not an unfortunate byproduct of conflict, but a weapon wielded deliberately and systematically. Beyond legal and political arenas, these stories reshaped public memory. Museums and memorials dedicated to the victims of wartime sexual slavery began to appear in Europe and Asia. Academic conferences devoted to the subject grew in number. School curricula slowly began to include the testimonies of women like Ruth O'Hearn. The act of speaking, once seen as dangerous or shameful, became a form of resistance, a way to reclaim agency and dignity stolen decades earlier. Survivors, many in their 70s and 80s, traveled across the world to tell their stories, sometimes to audiences of thousands, sometimes to a single classroom. Every time they spoke, they tore down a little more the wall of silence that had hidden their suffering from view. Yet even with these breakthroughs, the fight for recognition was far from over. Denial, revisionism, and political pressure continued to distort the narrative. Some survivors died before ever receiving an apology. Others lived long enough to see their testimonies dismissed as unreliable or exaggerated. But the power of their words endured. They transformed hidden trauma into historical record and forced a reckoning with a part of the Pacific War that many had preferred to forget. In doing so, they ensured that future generations would not inherit a sanitized version of history, that the shadows cast by the camps, the violence, and the silence would finally be brought into the light. The story of the Dutch women and children who suffered in the Japanese camps did not end when the gates opened in 1945. Liberation may have freed their bodies, but the shadows of captivity followed them into the post-war world, shaping not only their own lives but the way nations remembered or refused to remember what had happened. In the Netherlands, the legacy of the camps became a deeply personal and often private part of family history, spoken about in hushed tones, if at all. Many survivors returned home determined to rebuild their lives, to focus on the future rather than dwell on the horrors of the past. But silence carried a heavy cost. It allowed trauma to fester in the background, unacknowledged and unresolved, and contributed to a collective amnesia that left the suffering of tens of thousands largely absent from a national narrative of the war. Over time, however, memory began to break through that silence. In the decades that followed, memoirs were published, testimonies collected, and memorials erected. Annual remembrance ceremonies in the Netherlands and Indonesia began to include tributes to the civilian prisoners of war, and new generations were taught about the internment camps as part of a broader reckoning with the legacy of empire and occupation. Museums and archives now preserve diaries, letters, and artifacts from the camps, ensuring that the voices of those who endured them are not lost. These acts of remembrance are more than historical exercises. They are acknowledgments of injustice and suffering that had long been minimized or ignored. In Japan, the legacy is more complicated. The country's post-war narrative, shaped in large part by its own devastation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, often left little room for acknowledging the suffering it had inflicted on others. Official histories downplayed or omitted the existence of the camps, and the topic of comfort women remained a particularly sensitive and contested issue. Many Japanese officials maintained for decades that the women had been willing participants or that the military's role was minimal, claims that were repeatedly contradicted by survivor testimonies and archival evidence. Textbooks used in Japanese schools often glossed over or omitted references to wartime atrocities, prompting protests from historians and neighboring countries. Yet within Japan itself, a growing number of scholars, journalists, and activists have pushed back against denialism, demanding a fuller and more honest reckoning with the past. The debate over apologies and reparations has remained a central and often contentious part of this process. Survivors and their advocates have long argued that financial compensation, while important, is less significant than an unequivocal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Several Japanese prime ministers have issued statements of regret over wartime atrocities, including the use of forced labor and sexual slavery, but many of these statements have been carefully worded and sometimes contradicted by other government officials. Lawsuits filed by survivors in Japanese courts have been met with limited success, often dismissed on procedural grounds or blocked by claims of sovereign immunity. Nevertheless, The persistence of survivors and their supporters has kept the issue alive in international forums, forcing governments to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, responsibility, and historical memory. The impact of their testimonies extends far beyond the politics of apology. The experiences of women in the camps and their later willingness to speak publicly about them help reshape international law and the way the world understands wartime atrocities. The systematic use of sexual slavery during the Second World War played a significant role in the development of modern human rights law, influencing conventions on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the protection of civilians during conflict. The recognition that rape and sexual violence are not inevitable byproducts of war, but deliberate weapons of oppression owes much to the courage of those who broke decades of silence to tell their stories. Today, the legacy of the camps continues to evolve. Monuments in The Hague, Jakarta, and other cities bear the names of those who died and honor the endurance of those who survived. Educational programs, exhibitions, and documentaries keep their stories alive for new generations. Survivor organizations advocate for historical accuracy and support those still grappling with the psychological scars of captivity. At the same time, denial persists in some quarters, from nationalist groups in Japan who seek to rewrite the past to political figures who question the reliability of survivor testimony. These tensions reflect a broader struggle over how societies remember war, whether as a series of military victories and defeats or as a complex human tragedy that includes victims, perpetrators, and the painful truths that lie between. Ultimately, the memory of the camp stands as both a warning and a call to conscience. It warns of what can happen when war strips people of their humanity and turns cruelty into policy. And it calls on future generations to listen, truly listen, to the voices of those who suffered, so that their pain is not buried under layers of denial or indifference. In doing so, it challenges the world to build a future in which justice is not an afterthought, and where the lessons of the past are not forgotten. The women who once believed themselves erased from history have, through their courage and persistence, ensured that the world will never again be able to look away.